Hi everybody, welcome to Afterburner. I'm Bill Whittle. A few days ago, yours truly was 600 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean aboard the USS Pasadena. That's part of Subron 11, Submarine Squadron 11, based at Point Loma in San Diego. A group of about 20 of us DVs, the fact that I was a distinguished visitor means that the bar's obviously set pretty low, gathered in pitch black darkness at 6 a.m. and the sun came up around 6:45, and just at that moment, this dark, utterly silent, pitch black shape appeared in the channel, flanked by two huge tugboats. You know, most ships have personalities, airplanes certainly do. And as they lowered the gangway and she was being secured, I got a really strong vibe off of that submarine. To me, that boat looked really impatient, almost angry. You could tell she's a bad, bad girl, and she's just itching to get back out to sea where she belonged to get some serious work done. USS Pasadena is a Type 688I improved nuclear-powered Los Angeles-class fast attack submarine. She's longer than a football field and it's about as wide as a 4-lane highway. Now, up in her bow, if you knew where to look, and I do, you could just make out the panels that house the 12 vertical launching system tubes storing Tomahawk land attack missiles. Using the TLAMs, the Pasadena can reach out and touch someone about 1,000 miles away. But the real reason she's there is because of her 4 Mark 48 ADCAP torpedo tubes. Pasadena is built primarily to detect and destroy enemy submarines, and she's very, very good at it. So, when you go aboard, you descend through a pretty tight hatch. You're not going to see Michael Moore bashing the military from the inside of a submarine, that much I can promise you. And then you go down a ladder and you find yourself in the interior of a Los Angeles-class fast attack submarine, which looks like nothing. It doesn't look like anything I have ever seen in my life. Now, you know those old World War II sub-movies, you know, with the curved hulls and the valves and the machinery everywhere? It doesn't look anything like that. And it doesn't look like the crowded passageway on a sleeper car on a train. On the other hand, in the back of an airliner with that kind of cramped, really efficient galley and everything secured, that doesn't look like that at all. And it doesn't look a bit like kind of a wood-paneled booth in a snack bar at an American Legion post. But if you take all of those things and mash them together, you have a pretty good idea of what the inside of the USS Pasadena doesn't look like. And on the way out to sea, we learn more about her. All U.S. Navy vessels have their own unique crest and motto. Sailors' ships are their homes, and these are their welcome mats. The motto of the USS Pasadena, SSN 752, is anytime, anywhere. And on board the Pasadena, if anyone ever utters the word anytime, then everyone else in earshot has to shout anywhere. On the screen, we could see various surface contacts at various distances. Now, I'd assumed that they'd kind of take a look around every 5 minutes or so, but it was nothing like that. Nothing. The whole time, the whole hour. Contact to contact to contact. Zoom in, zoom out, next contact, contact, contact. Get a bearing and a distance and a heading, and then scan again to the next contact. Always looking, always listening, every second, all the time, constant, precise scanning for at least the hour it took us to get out there. In the cruise mess, they split us up into 3 groups. The nuclear engineering professors were in Group Alpha, the genuinely distinguished visitors were in Group Beta, and the rest of us, which would be, the jingle writers, hairdressers, tired TV producers, internet personalities, and telephone sanitizers, we got into Group Charlie, which actually was great because our host was the #2 enlisted man on the boat. He's a senior chief petty officer who's simply one of the most likable men I've ever met. He talked about the crew and life on board the sub, and he always talked about them the same way, our men, our people, our family, really. He counsels them on their careers and their mortgage payments and college options and wives and girlfriends and all that. And he's not just going through the motions either. You can tell by the way the other sailors interact with him that this guy is a terrific guy, these are his people, and he means to look after them. Because the sub is not like an aircraft carrier, a floating city with thousands of people, where you may occasionally behold the captain up in his tower. This is 120 men and 15 officers in a hole in the water with walkways just wide enough for one person to walk through comfortably. 2 people have to brush up against each other. On a submarine, if the captain's gained 5 pounds, you know it. You could tell that the civilians were because we were the ones always saying, excuse me, sorry about that. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, pardon me. Sailors are way past that now. We were in the officer's wardroom when it came time to dive. We sat in 6 chairs, 3 to each side of a small table. There was a 7th chair at the head of the table with a huge embroidered star on it. No one sits in that chair but the captain. which was impressed on me strongly enough that I was actually kind of afraid to even look at the chair. Then we hear it, dive, dive, and on the periscope display, sure enough, we see these geysers of mist coming out of the ballast tanks as the 6,000-ton boats add another 1,000 tons of seawater. And then the deck is awash, and then the seawater comes up on the periscope lens, and then there's nothing but sonar. Now came what submariners call angles and dangles. We started with a 5-degree down angle, and next thing you know, we're at 300 feet. You can just barely feel that. But then I had the sense to stand up out of the chair because the next one was 10 degrees down angle. And you really begin to feel something like that. I'm watching this depth counter in the back of the room going through 400 feet, 500 feet, 600 feet. She silently doubled her speed to about 19 knots now, and Pasadena is as solid as a rock. There's no vibration at all, no sense of motion. If you had a 100-watt electric bulb, that draws 100 watts. But just a few yards behind us, the GE S6G nuclear reactor is cranking out 165 million watts of heat, which is driving 2 steam turbines generating 35,000 shaft horsepower, and that is pushing a steel cylinder as wide as 3 Greyhound buses and as long as 10 of them end-to-end effortlessly through the pitch-black water. There's no sense of motion at all. You might as well have been sitting in a restaurant for about 10 seconds or so. And then it's up 15 degrees to 300 feet. And then it's down at 20 degrees to 600 again, angles and dangles. Everybody leaning hard just to stay upright because the floor is so tilted. And there's none of this creaking that you hear on the dives in the sub movies either. It's just a barely audible kind of a tap, 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 tap as the water pushes on the hull with a force of 260 pounds per square inch. Then finally, 25 degrees, back up to 150 feet. That's kind of like this, but with your feet close together. Now, after the angles and dangles, the senior chief showed us around. We saw the crew's quarters, which don't look like so much as triple bunks as a large box of tool shelves. And each one of them had a little black curtain on their rack. And that space, that curtain, is absolutely inviolate. Nobody puts their hand past that curtain without the owner's permission. Because in a space where space is at such a premium, there's a little tiny corner of the boat that's all yours. And then we saw the torpedo room, which looked more like a big flat storage basement, except for, torpedoes. And we didn't get to fire the torpedoes. Look, I understand that there were no Russian or Chinese subs closer to my country than I would like, but you'd think they could have blown up a raft of hippies or something, but no. All we did was shoot some water slugs. They fill the empty torpedo tube full of water, and then they blow it out with the same compressed air that they used to launch a Mark 48. It's the kind of showy, noisy, useless demonstration that's usually reserved for the Air Force. Surfacing, I got to watch from the control room, which is exactly as cool as it looks in the movies, but it's about a third of the size. Didn't remind me of the Hunt for Red October, but it did immediately remind me of this. It's small in there, but it is awful cool. There are sensors stations on the port side, fire control to starboard. And in the middle, there's an officer barking out commands. He's obviously the captain. And behind him stood in absolute silence a man who I took to be maybe his valet or his butler or something. He's probably the guy who hands a warm towel to the captain after he drinks his coffee. So we continue to check sonar contacts for probably, 20 minutes at 150 feet before climbing to periscope depth, which is less than that. And still well below the water, we checked and rechecked and checked again all the sonar contacts, doing a wide 180-degree turn while safely submerged to clear our baffles, which is the area directly behind us, which we can't hear through very well since we just moved 9,000 tons of water out of the way to get to where we are right now. And then the guy who I thought was the captain looked back at the guy who I thought was his valet, and the valet uttered one or two words, which I couldn't hear, and I was only 10 feet away from him. Then the first guy starts barking out some more orders, and then I realize he's not the captain. He's the officer of the deck. The captain is the quiet guy. He doesn't have to run around yapping all the time. He says one word or two words, and 135 men and 6,900 tons of nuclear-powered steel do what he wants it to do. It's good to be the king. This movie business of a cursory check and then, slap up the handle, surface the boat while the captain breaks out a fresh cigar, it's utter fiction. It took us 20 minutes of checking to get to periscope depth and at least another 20 minutes after that at periscope depth, looking for that raft of hippies or whatever else might be small enough and silent enough to evade the sonar that can hear for hundreds and hundreds of miles. But finally, the captain himself made a complete scan because you know what? This is his boat after all. It's his ultimate responsibility is on him and him alone. And that's why no one sits in his chair. And then he quietly gave the order to surface. Now that night after I got home, I looked the captain up on his Facebook page. I couldn't recognize him. On the surface, he seems just like a regular guy, but down on the boat, he looked like he was made out of granite. And as far as I'm concerned, he can have all of my nuclear weapons anytime he wants them. You know, the average age of an enlisted man on the Pasadena is about 22 years old. Junior officers are in their late 20s. The rest of them are in their early 30s, and I don't think the captain was a day over 40. And just for 1 second there, I was looking forward at the entire control room, and all of a sudden, the youth of these men burned through their disciplined demeanors. And I thought, you know, this is the world's smartest fraternity on a weekend. You know, that's exactly what it felt like. Hey, bro, you know what we ought to do? We ought to take my dad's nuclear sub and take her out to Hawaii. Wouldn't that be rad? Dude, awesome, let's do it. They're so young. Now, coming back to port on the surface at a lazy 8 or 9 knots, I had 5 entire minutes after climbing up a bunch of twisty and turny ladders to get to the top of the sail. And it was just a perfect Southern California day. The Pacific was as smooth as a lake, and there's a warm sun up there in the cloudless sky. And I thought, you know, this is the future that we should have had right here. Clean, limitless nuclear power, safe too. You know, I took a smaller radiation dose on that cruise than the people who'd stayed on the beach all day. These days especially, it's great to actually see intelligent, dedicated, patriotic, competent young men like Chop, who's the supply officer. They call him Chop because he wears an embroidered device on his lapel that looks kind of like a pork chop, and I got a chance to sit and talk to Chop for a while. He asked me to speak up a little bit because he's hard of hearing. I told him I was hard of hearing too. I lost my high-end hearing after several years of working in a dance club in Miami. Chop lost his when an IED exploded near him on his second tour of Iraq. He and his wife have a little girl, and he promised her that he'd be a little more careful, so he joined the silent service. Later this year, he and his wife are going to go and adopt a little girl from the Ukraine, and they're going to do it on an ensign's salary. When I think about the $10 billion per day that this government spends, it is shocking and disgraceful how little we pay these people who keep us all safe at home at nighttime. The Pasadena has enough nuclear fuel and can make enough air and water to circle the world 20 times underwater without stopping. The only restriction is the amount of food that they can store for the crew. And all of that food and all of those supplies go through Chop. So I turned to Chop and I said, so you're telling me that if you run out of coffee halfway through the 7-month deployment, that's your fault and no one else's? And Chop said, look, if we run out of coffee halfway through the deployment, I'm going forward to the torpedo room, I'm going to open up a tube, and I'm going to fire myself out into the ocean because that would not be nearly as bad as dealing with a sub-crew that had run out of coffee. The Pasadena, the boat, I mean not the crew, dropped us off about as impatiently as she'd picked us up, and just after I stepped off the walkway, they were casting off the lines again. They're heading right back out to sea to do more drills, you know, fire drills, flooding drills, torpedo drills, honing that boat and that crew to an edge that's ready for combat. You know, it'd been a while since Chop had seen his wife. She lives in San Diego, and here was the boat in San Diego to pick us up and drop us off, but the boat went right back out again, and he may not see his wife for another week. So you just think about that when you get a moment. You think about all those men and women in the sky or out in the deserts or on or under the waves who sleep in bunks the size of phone booths so we can do and say what we want in this country and not worry about our kids getting mortared on the way to school. So to close, just a private message to the past, present, and future crews of the USS Pasadena. If you guys ever need an extra hand to wash the coffee pots, I will sail with you again anytime.